Hello, everyone. My name is Martin, and as you probably know, I made this game called Twofold Inc., and this is a video version of a presentation I made about this game. So, Twofold Inc. is a puzzle game for mobile platforms where you can scroll the playfield to form shapes out of tiles that you can then clear away. Let's watch a little bit of the trailer. Yeah, and so it goes. This talk is going to assume some previous knowledge of the game. So if you haven't played it before, go buy it now, give me some money, and play it for a little bit and come back and watch this talk later. You can probably make do either way, but that's like the intended experience for this presentation anyway. So Twofold Inc. is a paid game. It's $4 or €4 if you're in Euroland. And since it launched in late January, it's had 360,000 players play about 7 million games played. So that's in roughly February, March, April, May. That's roughly 4 months. And the majority of these players are not paying for themselves, by the way. You cannot multiply $4 by 360,000 and get a number that's anywhere near real life. So don't try that. Before I made this game, I made a game called Capsule, which is a meditative strategy game featuring tetraminos set in space. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to tell you a little bit how Twofold Inc. came to be. So I started working on this game in late summer 2014, and the game launched in January this year. So that's about a year and a half from start to finish. It wasn't quite full time because I had some other things happen in the meantime. But all things considered, I reckon I put in about a year of full-time work. And I didn't originally set out to make a puzzle game. In fact, I'd been working on something else entirely right after finishing Capsule. But this project wasn't really going the way I'd hoped, so I decided after a couple of weeks or months working on it, like, I'm going to take a day off. I'm going to work on something purely for fun. So at the time, I was playing a game called 10 Million. It's also a puzzle game, and I quite like playing it. It's like a straight up match 3 game with some like dungeon crawling elements on top of it. There was, however, something that annoyed me about the game, like these little tiny decisions that I would have made differently if I was the one calling the shots. And because I'm a game developer, I decided I'm just going to make my own, and I'm going to make it better. Very humble. So I decided, yeah, let's just work on this. I live streamed it. Unfortunately, I didn't save the stream, so that's gone forever. But then you have this little screenshot from the stream, at least. I don't know exactly what's going on the left over there, but I wanted to make it really like feel super great to play, and then just go back to doing whatever I was doing originally. After just like a couple of hours of work, like the first day of work, I had this. So I decided at some point I would allow dragging between any number of tiles, like diagonally or orthogonally, which is a fancy word of saying straight, as opposed to diagonal, where you build these chains, which is a word I'm going to come back to, instead of like doing this traditional drag to swap mechanic. And this turned out to be a really big decision. I didn't know at the time, but it sort of set the tone for the entire philosophy behind the game's design. So all games or all game genres come with a bunch of baggage, and I'd argue that a genre in most respects is that baggage. Once you or someone else decides that you belong in this and this category, you're going to be compared and contrasted to everything else that's in the same category. Puzzle games, especially match 3 types of games, has this too. There's a very rigid form, which doesn't mean that they're not good. It's like match 3 games tend to scratch this like fundamental itch in your brain that makes you go, ooh, I like this. But they are also very formulaic. You match the things fall down, you match more things, maybe you get a combo, more things fall down, and you repeat. It's not a very long loop. So I got curious and I wanted to see what would happen if I took the road less traveled. What if I took all the assumptions of the format and didn't do things that way, like explicitly did not do the typical thing? And as I said, I started with the matching. So I was using a chain across multiple tiles, which turned out to allow for much more creative matches, where like a standard match 3 game only has like a handful of variations of a match. This allowed for much more creative play. But this is all getting ahead of where I'm actually at with this program or this project right now. So far, I've only worked a single day on this game. It felt good to play. There's no scoring, no sound, no room for any actual strategizing or anything, but it felt good. So I tried the game on some friends, and it seemed to work. So I decided let's just keep at it for a few more days, and we'll see where it goes. So now I had to figure out a way to make the game last. So smashing out a bunch of matches was good fun for about 2 minutes, and then not so much. But with 2 good minutes, you can do a lot of things. So the moment-to-moment game loop was already working. Now I needed to fill in these longer loops that layer on top. And as things turned out, this is what ended up taking almost a year of fiddling. Now, going back to that earlier thing about the road less traveled. With Rimkapsel, I set a few rules for myself early in development that ended up being sort of the pillars that the entire design rested on. And that worked so well, I really wanted to do it again with twofold. So as I was playing with the prototype, I realized that playing really fast felt super great. So I wanted to allow for fast players. So this made me consider slapping some kind of time limit on a game and using that as like the challenge of the game. However, this totally felt like the easy and obvious way out. So that was something I didn't really want to do. So I decided, let's not have time limits. Let's allow the player to play the game at any speed, either very slow or very fast. No judgment on either. And this ended up being like boiling down to be 2 rules, which was 1, stay away from obvious solutions, and 2, allow for any speed of play, which is it's kind of a sub rule to the first rule, but here we are. And with these 2, I sort of set out to figure out the rest of the game. The game is just still a crappy prototype. You can basically match whatever, wherever. So now it's time to try and make the matching a little bit more interesting. So after about 3 weeks of fiddling about, I struck upon the key mechanic of the entire game. So I had a friend visiting, and we were talking about ways to make it more challenging. And one of us, I honestly can't remember if it was my friend or it was me, suggested, what if you required touching every tile in an area of color? And this was a huge improvement. Suddenly you had to think about what could be removed, how to do it, and then maybe how to fix it if it wasn't immediately removable. But this also revealed a new problem. Pretty quickly you'd get a stale board. These sort of checker patterns would start appearing, and since a proper match requires 2 tiles at a minimum, you'd eventually run out of moves to make. So I was spawning new tiles in a purely random fashion to try and combat this checker pattern and also make the things a little bit more interesting, I guess. I decided to make the spawning smarter. So when a tile has been removed, it looks at how many of each of the 4 colors are on the board, like the entire board. And I use this to weigh the rolls, so that if there's not much blue on the board, you're more likely to get blue. It also looks at the adjacent blocks. So if a block is surrounded by yellow, it in itself is more likely to spawn as yellow. And this ended up being a slight improvement, but there was still no way you could keep playing forever. The board would still lock up eventually. So I had to come up with something that would let a player fix the board. And the way every other match 3 game, more or less, solves this problem is gravity. Making a match will have new blocks fall down from the top of the screen, giving you a fresh set of block configurations to play with. But I set up this rule of not doing what everyone else was doing, so I couldn't do that. I considered allowing the player to move individual tiles, but that became a huge UI problem. I considered having tiles grow old and remove themselves, but communicating that also became a problem, which is, you can see it happening right now. You can see them blinking. I considered wildcard tiles that would allow you to switch between colors in a single move. So you'd go red, 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 wildcard, blue, blue, wildcard, yellow, yellow. And that got really, really confusing. So after about 10 days of mucking about and trying things, I came up with the scrolling. And this was like the second breakthrough of the game's development. All of a sudden, you could move any tile around to where you wanted it, with the drawback of making a mess of the rest of the board. It worked really, really well. Maybe the only drawback of the scrolling was that the natural way to do it would be to grab on the board and move the rows. But grabbing or touching the board and moving your finger was already making a chain. So I had to put it on the edge of the board by tapping. You would scroll. And that ended up working really well once you explain it to players. And also right around this time, I decided I don't need diagonal matches. Orthogonal is just fine. And actually being locked to just 4 directions from a tile limits the possibility space a little bit, making it a little bit more bearable to think about what a solution could be. So now I had like the next level of the game loop down. The shortest loop was about dragging and touching the tiles. The next order up was figuring out how to exactly do that. And on top of that came the scrolling. Now it was time to figure out the next layer, and this turned out to be much, much harder. I figured I needed some kind of scoring, but again, having it be purely score-based wasn't really an option since it didn't have an ending, and you could just keep playing forever. And I couldn't put a time limit because that was against my rules, so I got a bit stuck. In fact, I got so stuck, I decided to do something completely different for a little bit. I decided to make a solver that figures out if an area of color is solvable or not, just for fun. This, however, is a talk all on its own, so I'm going to skip it for this video and maybe come back to it in a later video. Or you can just bother me on Twitter and I might try to explain it there. But you can look at this really cool animation of the solver doing its work. Pretty cool. So anyway, for the scoring, which I hoped would be like the next gameplay loop that would go on top of the ones I already had, I had a few ideas. I knew I wanted to reward long chains, so a chain of 6 tiles needed to be worth more than 2 chains of 3, even though they had the same absolute count of tiles. I wanted to reward the longer one more. I also needed to limit scrolling somehow. With unlimited scrolls and some practice, you can rearrange the board to be exactly as you want it. And this is fun for a little bit, but mostly it rewards this tedious kind of play, which is not something I wanted in the game. So I tried just giving straight up scores per tile, but that didn't reward long chains enough. So you would get the problem where a 6 tile chain would be worth just as much as 2 3 tile chains. So I tried adding a multiplier per 4 tiles, which the 4 is just completely arbitrary. But that seemed very opaque. It's hard to understand. Like, why are you getting a multiplier at 4 tiles or 3 tiles or 5 tiles? So then I tried giving, say, 10 points for the first tile, 12 for the next, 14 for the third, and so on. But that was really hard to keep track of in your head. And it didn't really matter which curve the scoring followed. You couldn't just look at a bunch of tiles and know what the score would be beforehand. So now it's been about 2 months since I started, and I had another breakthrough. I realized that doubling the value of a chain, which each tile would make it reasonably easy to count, and it would massively reward longer chains. Little did I know, but this was actually the last breakthrough I would have in making this game, which was sort of the end of the honeymoon phase of this project. So now that I had the scoring kind of worked out, at least, it was time to start on the levels or whatever the game would have. And this turned out to be a massive challenge. So having a straight up score counter didn't really work, partly because I had no way to limit moves, but mostly because it felt like you were playing for nothing. There was very little sense of progress. So I tried having separate bars per color, and that didn't really work either. It had the exact same problems. Plus, you'd get a giant chain of some color, like 20-something tile chain, and you get millions of points, completely dwarfing any scores you've gotten before, making all your work up to that point feel entirely pointless. So I tried things. I tried so many things. And after a few weeks of trying things, a very long time that is hard to get across how desperate I was there for a little bit. The idea of the request began to form. And here you can see a very early version of them on the lower left. And at first, it was just a number you needed to beat. So if you had a 4, an 8, and a 16, all you needed was a single 16 on the board, and you would clear them all because the number you got was bigger. But then I figured out it worked a lot better if hitting one request would remove from the total. So instead of clearing all of those 3 requests, it would only clear the 16. And then I had the problem with the moves, and it took me even more weeks before I figured out that I could attach move counts to the actual requests instead of having a single global counter, which I have in this the little video here. It's on the upper right. And this video is also actually from before I figured out the scoring, so you can see the weird multiplier appear sometimes. And for a while, hitting a challenge, regardless of how much, would not make its counter go down. But after even more weeks of fiddling, the bonus moves began to come clear. And this took a very long time, like months. And in the end, this is the way it works. So each request, which are these 3 things that are at the top of the screen, each request has a number of moves, which is the green number, the number in the circle. Making a move will make them all tick down. So either clearing something on the board or scrolling the board. If you clear an entire bar on a request, which is all of one color, say I get 8 yellow here, we'll make that number, the number of moves ticks up instead of down, so giving you effectively 2 extra moves. If you clear an entire request, so say I get 16 white, or 8 white, that would be enough to clear the one with the 2 on it. It will make the other one tick up instead. So that gives bonus moves to the other requests. And they also reorder, so whichever request has the fewest moves remaining will always be hit first. And when a request runs out of moves, you lose a life. It's a little bit involved, but that was what it took to get it to work properly. But this still had problems. Sometimes you get a request that was way too big for what you had on the board, and you just get stuck there, making you lose tons of lives for like a single unlucky draw. So you just plug your entire process or whatever. So I needed something that could help smooth out these little bumps on the road. And the solution, which also took a really long time to figure out, was to have any request that hits you. So if you get hit by a 64, that 64 turns into a 32. If you get hit a second time, it goes from 32 to 16, and then to 8, and then to 4. And if you get hit a 5th time or whatever, it will actually just go away because nothing will ever be below 4. And then I give back a life after every wave. A wave is a set of 3 requests, so basically a level. And this made this type of problem much more rare, so it smoothed out the experience a little bit. And if you made a mistake early on, you could just recover from it a little bit later. So in parallel with trying to figure this stuff out, I was working on generating requests. And I wanted to have them be procedural. So the game was looking like it would be this like play forever kind of thing. So having an infinite supply of challenges seemed like a really good idea. And I wanted the requests to scale in the same manner as the numbers on the playfield. So 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on. It felt like a nice callback, like tie the game together. So I thought like a challenge is between 1 and 4 colors. It has a number of moves and it has a single number per color. How hard could it be to generate these? Like I have a number that represents the difficulty. I should just be able to churn these out at a selected difficulty. It shouldn't be that hard. Turns out it's pretty hard. And there are many reasons that it is like this. But spawning a single challenge of a reasonable difficulty wasn't all that hard. What I didn't consider was that with the bonus moves, they interacted with each other. So a hard request paired with 2 easier requests would actually make the hard one easier as well, since you could get bonus moves from the first 2. And vice versa as well. 3 hard requests at once is much, much harder than it should be because they combine, sort of. So I spent weeks trying to generate challenges in a purely procedural fashion, but I could never quite get the scaling to feel right. And it was super cumbersome to try and adjust because it required me playing like multiple games to see if like, is this working? Does it feel the way I want it to feel? But it was always like either it started out too easy or it started out too hard or never quite transitioned into the challenge I wanted it to. So I just buckled and decided I'll use a hybrid approach. So I have this big spreadsheet where I would specify each variation of a request. So you can see on the top row, There's the one that's just a single 4. On the second row, there's a request that's just a single 8. If you move down a little bit on like row 8 or something, there's the double 4, and there's an 8 and a 4, and so on. And the colors are still assigned procedurally. But here I can just type out all the requests I want in the game. And along the rightmost x-axis, you can see the difficulties. On the upper right, you see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 24 or something like that. And here I can just mark where I want a particular request to spawn. And the numbers on the upper right are the difficulty levels. So as you're playing, you are moving right way or like up on the x-axis. And this allows me to very easily tweak when and where a request will appear. Like if it's too hard, I can just move it later. If it's too easy, I can move it earlier. Much easier to get an overview of what's going on. And I can also calculate the number of moves the requests will have, which I at first was doing in pure code, but I actually moved it to the spreadsheet. So this is the equation that's in the spreadsheet today for calculating how many moves a request should have. And it's basically looking at the number of tiles required to clear the request. But it wasn't really working the way I wanted it to. And you can see like there's plenty of magical numbers, like it's times 0.6, times 0.345, like these tiny little adjustments. But in the end, I added this extra cell at the end called L2, which is my favorite thing. And it's this equation that looks at even more things I can figure out from the request. And that finally adjusts it to the level I wanted it to be at. And I would just play around like tons and tons of rounds and see like which requests ended up being the hard ones, which were the easy ones. And I would try to adjust the equation to compensate. I wouldn't actually go in and manually change them, but I would just tweak the equation instead. And it took what felt like 1,000 years to get it right, but it ended up working quite well. And having it be in the spreadsheet made it so much easier because I could I would duplicate it, so I could see like if I do this change, I can see the relative changes compared to the way it worked before. I didn't have to run the game; I could just try it. Ended up working super well. And by now, I'm maybe 6 months into the project. And once I had the requests working acceptably, this allowed me to move on to the part I dread most of any game project, and that is teaching the players how to play. And this time, I had really set myself up to fail. So having a relatable setting to your game really helps. Enemies with spikes on in Mario, you can't jump on them. You don't really need to explicitly explain that. Once it's happened to you once, you can maybe figure it out. Barrels of gasoline probably explode when you shoot them. You don't really need to explain that. Water will extinguish fire. It just makes some kind of internal sense. But this being an abstract puzzle game, I have nothing like that to lean back on. And actually, the good thing about a genre is that you can lean back on tropes of the genre in the same way and use tropes from similar games to yours and just have like the player's previous knowledge help you out. But since I decided to be a unique snowflake and do things differently, that pre-existing knowledge is actually wrong and it will mess players up instead. And this is how I started the slog that was making the tutorial for Twofold. And the thing is, nobody likes a tutorial. Many players just skip them and move on and understand nothing of the game, which is your problem as a designer. Even though every designer would like to blame the players, but that's not quite the way it works. So with the Rymdkapsel, I went to great pains to never have the tutorial take control away from the player. If you played along with the tutorial, it will hold your hand through the introduction. It will teach you what you need to know. But it's all context sensitive. So if you decide to do something else, the game will try and help you as best as it can and try to figure out what it is you're trying to do and be helpful with that. It turned out pretty well in the end. It was a lot of work, but I wanted something similar for Twofold. But much to my surprise, it turns out that a puzzle game and a real-time strategy game are not the same thing. So after trying many things, including actually a store where you could buy game mechanics, I'm so happy I didn't go with that. It ended up with me again giving up and coming back to a much more traditional tutorial that actually even blocks the player from doing things ever so briefly, which is something I really didn't want to do. But in the end, I found it would just be necessary to have the players pay actual attention to what you wanted them to do. If not, they will just try to do whatever they did last and just breeze through the tutorial and not really pick up on things. So the tutorial has been this thing that I've endlessly tweaked. I've tried to keep it as short as I possibly can, because I only have so much attention from a new player, and yet get the necessary information in there. And the really important parts are gated, meaning that if you don't understand what you're supposed to do, it makes it really hard for you to progress. And the slightly less important things, it will let you fail and just move on because it's not that important. And I'd rather you move on to the game and maybe liking it than just closing, like rage quitting the tutorial and never coming back. That's not a good option. And it has a few things, and most notably of these is probably the buffer, which is this area at the bottom of the screen. You can see at the very bottom of the screen, there's a bunch of colored squares. There's a lot of colored squares, I'm aware, but the ones at the bottom of the screen, this is the buffer. It's kind of important if you want to be a good player, but it's not in the tutorial at all. It's not explained anywhere in the game. And I had it in the tutorial for a little bit, but it turned out to be too much information too soon for new players. So after going back and forth on it a bunch of times, I've decided I'm just going to take it out of the tutorial and hope the players find it on their own. And it's a little bit of a bold move. I'm not entirely sure it's the right move, but I'm pretty confident that it was. And it tries to like get your attention and be like, hey, touch me, try to figure out how I work. But some players actually never find it. So one thing the game does, it's not super rare, but it's like a good trick, is it won't actually ask you if you want to play the tutorial the first time you play it. It will just put you in the tutorial immediately. It's like, there's a saying about this, I can't remember it exactly, but it's like, why ask and risk no for an answer? Just put players in the tutorial and have them go immediately. And this is very much that type of situation. So this is a talk or a video or whatever, and it's a fairly linear experience, and it does give the impression that I finished one part of the game before I moved on to the next, which isn't quite the case. I was continuously tweaking the request spawner and the tutorial and even the core game rules throughout the entire project. And it's this parallel kind of process, which is a complete mess and really maybe only possible if you're a very small team or a one-person team. And Twofold ended up being this really hard-fought project. Rymdkapsel was a smooth experience by comparison. And I was actually quite nervous to see if it would actually all tie together in the end. But it did. People seem to really like it. Reviews have been great. Players seem to really like it. It's been selling fairly well. It just took a really long time and a lot of work. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a break, take care of my kid, have a summer break, and then after summer, I'm going to come back and I'm going to start this process all over again with a new game, which I have no idea what it's going to be yet, but it's going to be very exciting. If you have any questions, you can either comment on this video. You should also do all the YouTube-y things like the video, subscribe, all of that stuff. If you have questions, again, you can just put a comment or tweet me. You can see my Twitter handle on the screen right now. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening.